Well, it's been claimed that the highest levels of New Zealand politics have been penetrated by Chinese government agents of influence, funding being channeled into the New Zealand government and opposition parties, and that therefore this helps explain a weakening of New Zealand foreign policy, especially when it comes to its position on China.
How credible, though, are those claims, given just in recent days Jacinda Ardern has said that they are very aligned with Australia's position?
Well, the US suspicions of New Zealand, of course, go back a long way to the 1980s, when New Zealand effectively banned US nuclear-armed and powered ships into its harbours. In the last couple of years, suspicions in the US of New Zealand have cranked up again over the China question. But what we saw in the last, and look, there has been some substance to it. There was a member of the New Zealand Parliament in the Nationals Party who was a former member of one of China's intelligence agencies, who had not declared that fact before standing for Parliament and yet sat in the National Parliament. And he was later disclosed to have been a trainer of Chinese spies. So there is some substance to the fact that New Zealand has hardly been vigilant when it comes to foreign interference and penetration. But as you say, Bev, in the last couple of days, New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has really made a big point, together with Scott Morrison, of declaring a united front, if I can use that term, with Australia against China's more troubling policies.
Does it mean, though, that they are sort of catching up to Australia in terms of introducing legislation that addresses some of these issues?
Oh, yes. Yes, it's a long way behind. And foreign interference and espionage in New Zealand is not really being enforced. The laws aren't really being enforced with any rigour at all, and there's much more that needs to be done. But what we did see is at the top level of New Zealand, we saw a correction back from what in recent months had seemed like some pretty wishy-washy positioning, where New Zealand seemed to be prepared to tolerate positions and behaviours by the Beijing regime, including its militarisation of maritime properties which had been claimed by its neighbours, including the mass repression of the Uyghur population of China's Xinjiang province, things like that, where New Zealand had been very wishy-washy. It's now issued a joint statement with Australia, which is very firm on all those positions, and it must have succeeded because the Foreign Ministry in Beijing has described it as a serious violation of international law that Australia and New Zealand should criticise Chinese policy. So it's obviously found its mark.
Does it, though, raise questions about how reliable a partner in the Five Eyes alliance New Zealand is?
Well, this is one of the perceptions that was gathering in Washington, D.C. and in Canberra, I should add, that New Zealand is some sort of a soft strategic underbelly to Australia to allow Chinese penetration and manipulation. So what Jacinda Ardern has started to do now is to address that perception, to defend New Zealand's position as a Five Eyes partner and member, and to correct that. And it's past time, really, that New Zealand attend to that perception in Canberra and Washington, and more importantly, defend New Zealand's own national interests against what we know are the malign intentions of the Chinese Communist Party and its United Front Work Department to penetrate, manipulate and control from afar New Zealand's political system. It's exactly the same set of goals that China has towards Australia, but Australia has taken earlier and firmer action in standing up to it.
It is tricky, I suppose. Every country is so nervous about getting the reaction that Australia's got, and we have literally been put on ice. And interestingly enough, Malcolm Turnbull at a recent launch for your new book said that we should expect to be frozen out by China for some time.
Yes, he said that there seemed to be no indication of any rethink in China. He said that it was obvious that China's trade sanctions on Australia had failed, in his words, had failed, and in fact were counterproductive, that they had actually hardened Australian opposition, not softened Australian opposition. but that Australia should expect to be in the freezer for quite a long time. And he looked to the precedent or the example of a country, a smaller country subject to a long-standing trade embargo from a great power, and that was Cuba. He pointed to the US trade embargo on Cuba, which is now nearly 60 years old. And Malcolm Turnbull made the point that although that trade embargo had been designed to try and bring down the communist regime in Cuba, it had had the counterproductive effect of unifying Cuba and strengthening the communist regime against the US. And his point there was, I suppose, twofold. One, that it was possible for a smaller country to withstand trade sanctions even by an overweening power right next door. But secondly, that great powers are capable of holding in place for a very long time entirely counterproductive foreign policies.
Indeed. And well, as long as Australia doesn't suffer economically the way Cuba has, it may be something that does play well for Australian governments to stand up to China. Interestingly enough, Peter, of course, China yesterday talked about allowing couples to have up to 3 children. So this has been a very rapid change from the very strict one-child policy. It's no surprise because you've seen some very alarming predictions for China's dwindling population.
Yes, that's right. There are demographers in China's system, as well as internationally renowned demographers, who agree that on the demographic trajectory on which China now finds itself, its current population of 1.4 billion will fall, and now we know that much. I mean, that's already baked into the trends, that it will start to fall in absolute terms in the next few years, but that by the end of this century, so 80 years or so hence, it will halve. It will halve from 1.4 billion to roughly 700 million, which would be the most rapid in percentage terms, but also obviously in absolute terms, decline in population anywhere in the world.
It is astounding to think what the economic ramifications would be.
If in fact demography is destiny, as is often claimed, then that suggests China's destiny is to become the first power in modern history to become old before it fully becomes rich, and then to go into a long, steady and predictable decline unless it takes drastic action, the sort you've mentioned, liberalising number of children people can have, but even that seems unlikely to have any immediate or powerful effect in China's case.
Great to talk as always, Peter. Thanks so much.
Pleasure, Bev.